this session, and we'll get started. Do you have questions or comments out of last Monday's class? Okay. The second question I have is let's see, I want to take a look at we've been busy all afternoon, so okay. So this week we have assignments and discussions. I see that no one's done those yet. Discussions, as usual, are the initial post is due tonight. So, excuse me. So, you know, we want you to get that done. What we will do, I'm going to continually sort of monitor my email for a few minutes to see if we hear from anyone else. So on Monday we talked about some public health threats. We talked about smoking, and this week's discussion is about smoking. So I think that we want you to really put some thought into that discussion and the issues being raised. And tonight we'll talk about some other issues, diet and physical inactivity. And I've been trying to update and have not finished collecting all of the 5th edition PowerPoints, but much of the material will be the same. So I think we're going to look at that first then. So let me bring that up and share that screen. Pardon? Up to the chapters for your reading and the chapters that are listed in the I changed the numbers of the chapters as listed in your readings and tools, and I will make sure that next week all of the correct PowerPoints are in. But there are a few of those. Okay, so we've got a number of issues here to do with the risks that we have of obesity. And of course, they're pretty obvious as a list: cardiovascular disease, diabetes, arthritis, and interestingly, certain cancers are associated with obesity. And the problem is that we seem to be we have a really interesting dichotomous society. If you go out, if you look at all the fast food places, they've all gone to these, you know, you can biggie size it. Well, the small size of everything they offer is more than enough food for most people. Now, if you're a competition swimmer needing 14,000 calories a day, that isn't true. But if you're most of us who only need really literally at most a couple of thousand calories a day, these things get to be ridiculous, and they get to be a little bit, it plays on something in our psyche that responds to greed. And I'm not sure what it is. I've never understood why someone would go in and get a triple bacon cheeseburger and biggie size it and get a giant fries to go along with it. That just strikes me as, unless you're splitting it between 4 people, that strikes me as just real overkill. And the pun was intended. Pardon? Yeah. Well, but we do have a problem with that. You go into a restaurant in this country and they serve you a plate of food that is significantly bigger than almost anybody needs. And I know people who refuse to take home leftovers. So if they don't eat it, they let it get thrown away, which to me is such an incredible waste. I just don't understand it. But if you go to Europe and go into a restaurant serving the same kind of food, portion sizes are about half. Yeah. They're very much smaller. And if you eat the entire portion, it's basically what you'd have here. You just don't have any leftovers. And Europeans are not big on leftovers, at least not in restaurants, because they haven't had to be. And some restaurants, one of my favorite restaurants is right up the road here on College, one of my favorite Mexican places. And when we go there, I order a plate of food, and what I take home will give me at least 2 more meals. I mean, the plates are gigantic. And I see people just going from one end of the plate to the other and cleaning it out. And, they're obviously not competition athletes. Now, some of them could easily be physical laborers, and arguably that's not unreasonable. The problem with that, of course, is that we don't do physical labor all our lives. Most of us don't. Most people will do that until we get into our 40s or so, and then it's too much for us. But you're used to eating huge amounts, and then you start to balloon. Right. You don't adjust. So we have a funny attitude about this. Plus, the nutritional value of many of the things we eat is not good. It's quite popular to talk about how store-bought tomatoes are just not any good, and they're not. If you grow your own tomatoes at home, you know exactly that, because they actually taste like tomatoes. Or if you happen to have farm family like we do, and can get fresh off the vine farm grown tomatoes, or use a farmer's market, you know exactly what we're talking about. That doesn't mean they don't have any nutritional value. It just means they don't taste good, which means you don't eat as much of them because they don't taste good. Now, is there good and bad to that? Sure. But nonetheless, we find that there has been a very great increase in obesity. The statistics are that 2/3 of American adults are overweight or obese. And I mean, some people morbidly obese. I can't believe the number of people I see who are so morbidly obese that they cannot walk around a grocery store. They have to ride one of those carts. And there is a demographic difference. And we find that Socioeconomic status is a big predictor as well. People of a higher socioeconomic status tend to have lower rates of obesity. We're seeing problems all over the world with this, because if you go into places like India or China, where traditionally people have had more restricted ability to get food, and you see as the socioeconomic status of all groups, and we're not, India is a caste society, China isn't, but all groups in every caste in India, as they acquire more resources, which translates really as money, they tend to start eating a worse and worse diet, and they start tending toward obesity. And again, that's different from here. There, it's a sign of wealth, whereas here, you can almost always say it's a sign of lower socioeconomic status. Not always, by any stretch of the imagination. But we do tend to run to obesity. The real disturbing factor is overweight among young people, adolescents and teenagers, and pre-adolescents, and the rise in type 2 diabetes in children, which is almost always dietarily related. When we lived in North Carolina, it wasn't uncommon to see some of the lower socioeconomic status children come to school with breakfast, and breakfast was a bag of Cheetos and a Pepsi. Well, there is no nutritional value in either of those things. I won't call them foods, because they're not. Cheetos is just basically, air surrounded by a layer of fat and salt. And soft drinks, by and large, have no real positive nutritional value. So we're starting to see that problem arise. That's one of the reasons diabetes is rising all over the country. There are all sorts of federal guidelines for nutrition. Pardon? Did you say something, Layla? Okay. Their federal guidelines keep changing, but they all basically have been, throughout my lifetime, they've been very, very similar. We're supposed to eat significantly more servings of fruits and vegetables. My ear is getting blasted out by Layla's daughter. And less grains.
My daughter passed out in the back seat.
Well, that's okay. We have, but we're supposed to be having less grains, refined sugar, salt. Cholesterol goes in and out of the consciousness. We need cholesterol because it's a component of our cell walls, and it's an important factor. But we manufacture essentially all in our own bodies. We manufacture enough cholesterol, so we don't need the extra cholesterol. We've all heard about the bugaboos of trans fats and saturated fats. So while the ratios have changed, the basic idea hasn't changed in my lifetime for what a good diet consists of. The sad part is that only, a very small, like single-digit percentage, low single-digit percentage of Americans eat a diet that has the proper mix of all of these different factors, with fruits being some of the most commonly omitted. But you look at what people are eating, and even those eating lots of vegetables will eat iceberg lettuce. Iceberg lettuce is something that my younger daughter refers to as crunchy water, because iceberg lettuce has absolutely no nutritional value. It's cheap. So, and potatoes, including lots of potato chips and French fries and stuff like that, which are, not the very best. If you're going to eat potatoes, you're probably, the best bet is a baked potato with nothing on it. Well, that's kind of boring, I have to admit. And I'm not a dietary faddist either. In fact, I'm not interested in fad diets. Almost all of them are a crock. What you should be doing is following the nutritional guidelines to the extent that you can. Partly, one of the reasons that fruits are omitted so often is that people can't afford them. Okay, and the good ones are all seasonal. Right now we're lucky, we're in Palisade peach season. Outside of this season, we don't touch them because we don't like them. So we find other kinds of fruit that we take. Canned vegetables are something that should be used sparingly. And one of the reasons is that they are so high in salt and sugar. It's not that they're, it's not that a canned tomato is bad for you. I mean, as a tomato, it's going to have much of the same nutritional components of a regular tomato, but there's all the salt and sugar that they throw in with it that really isn't good. If you look at the labeling on many of these things, the amount of salt alone is daunting. You can have a very small number of servings of many things and be way over your daily recommended dose of salt alone. And salt is a contributor. Some argue about this, but there is no argument that, at least in African Americans, salt is a major contributor to hypertension. Some of the rest of us don't have that problem, but it's just not a good idea. And of course, you go in and you look, you drive by a Walgreens, and the sign out front says, a 12-pack of Coke for $3. Well, that sounds like a good deal, except that Coke is really, there is nothing nutritional about these things. And we don't drink milk. Now, milk is an arguable issue because, of course, many people are intolerant of lactose, and so milk is not necessarily a great thing. We label our food as best we can with nutritional information, such as calories, fat and sugar content, salt content. There is an effort to reduce the requirements for that, and that may or may not be a good thing. I don't think it particularly is, personally. So another part of the effort is to try to limit the focus of advertising of unhealthy options that is directed at children. And much of it is. I mean, when I was growing up, breakfast cereal commercials were aimed at children, and they were the sugar frosted flakes and other things that are just awful. I mean, they don't taste good, you know, and then they try to gussy them up and say, well, it's healthy because there's no sugar in it because they put in artificial sweeteners. Well, we didn't evolve eating artificial sweeteners. So my personal bias is not to trust them. And on top of that, they don't taste right. And all of the natural substitutes like stevia and agave and so forth don't taste right. So we do like our sugar, however. So we need to start with kids. You know, for the long term, recommendations are to really start with kids and start with breastfeeding, and push breastfeeding as being the thing that should be done with babies. And indeed, there is a reason breast milk is recommended. After about 6 or 7 months, it's probably not necessary. However, it's still a good, healthy alternative for a baby before they are able to eat solid foods. And then what we did with our kids is one of the nicest baby presents we got was a little handheld food mill. And basically it was just like a surface that had lots of holes in it, and then something that would grind up the food and push them through the holes to make them possible. So we started at that point, when our kids started eating solid foods, they went to restaurants with us, and we'd simply throw some in the mill and they'd eat it. One of our favorite restaurants was a Chinese restaurant in the city that we were living in when our kids were babies. And they loved our kids. We'd take them into the restaurant, sit them in a high chair, and they would take care of the kids, the people working there. But the other thing is that we would order like hot and sour soup, which has tofu in it. And we pull out the tofu chunks and throw them on the high chair for the kids, and they'd sit there and eat it happily. So they started eating what we ate essentially as soon as they were capable of it. As a result, they eat everything. Well, actually not quite. My older daughter's kind of a barbarian about mushrooms. She hates mushrooms. But virtually everything that we have ever eaten. So, I mean, and we've always tried to eat semi-healthily. Someone may argue that Chinese food isn't necessarily real healthy, but like anything else, moderation. Plus activity. Epidemiologically, we know that people who are active physically live longer, have healthier lives. They have lower risk of diabetes, lower risk of various forms of cancers, lower risks of cardiovascular disease. So the twin pillars of disease prevention are good nutrition and exercise. Add in some genetics. There's a genetic component to it as well. There are some people who are just naturally healthier. But that's a minor component compared to, that's one that's easily overcome by the other two, bad nutrition and no activity. So we have lots of reasons to do that. There's all sorts of guidance about exercise. Won't go into that here because, you know, everybody knows it. You know, you're supposed to do 30 minutes a day of exercise at least 5 days a week or something like that as an adult. More is better. Get out from in front of the TV and the video game terminal, and go out and play with the dog, whatever. That's something that we all know is the case, but it's hard to get people to exercise. You know, at an early age, they need to be encouraged to do things like ride bikes, you know, walk, and really just, excuse me, and really make an effort. And there's lots of ways. Physical activity doesn't have to be the same thing all the time. And it doesn't necessarily mean going to the gym twice a week, although that's certainly better than nothing. And this needs to be done to really with children, to get them started on that. There are lots and lots of drugs that people take to lose weight. Do they work? Only if the people taking them change their lifestyle. Durham, North Carolina, where we lived for 15 years, was known as the diet capital of the world 20 years ago. Might still be. There are so many weight loss clinics in Durham. That is amazing. People would flood in. So we'd have all these obese people come in, and they'd come in and they'd lose a bunch of weight because they were on a diet program, and then they'd go away, and next year they'd come back and they were just as big as before, and they'd go through it again because they didn't change their lifestyle and their relationship with nutrition and exercise. And it wasn't uncommon to see someone who weighed 300 pounds, and they were in town for one of the diet programs. It wasn't uncommon to see them go to an ice cream store and get the biggest thing they could get of ice cream and eat the whole thing, because they were not willing to change their relationship with nutrition. So right here, there are several discussion questions that can be looked at for in the chapter on obesity, and one of them are, here's some ideas about environmental factors that actually discourage us from actually having a healthy diet. Have some ideas here. And environmental really is a broad term. We're not talking about air and water pollution, that sort of thing. We're talking about the environment in which we live, that includes how we have to work, advertising, all these things. We can't do much about air pollution and water pollution as individuals. But what are the environmental factors that discourage the individual from these things? You can think of a couple, I'm sure. The way people what?
Present themselves, like how they dress, or how they want to dress, I guess.
It could. It could. How do you see that connection?
Well, with teenagers now, it's like have nice bodies, so they want to show them off.
Okay.
Like all the adults are like, like oh my
Yeah.
god.
Thick as a pencil. Yeah, right. Yeah. Actually, I've read recently that they were actually putting weight on Barbie,
Yeah.
making her look a little bit more like a human being. So, okay, so the desire for the way they, because, yeah, eating a healthy diet is also not starving yourself to death, right? So, anorexia, bulimia, all those things where people think that they have to get smaller and smaller because that's what the Hollywood presents, right? Um, so, yeah, that's a factor.
Or maybe the opposite. Like people don't want to look that skinny, so they get bigger.
Some reactionary issues, yeah, right. What about advertising?
I know what is that? Jenny Craig? Is that?
Jenny Craig?
I think that weight loss program.
Oh yeah, Jenny Craig weight loss, yeah.
So like, who was doing? I don't remember her name, but she wasn't losing any weight, so they fired her or they let her go. I don't remember.
Hmm.
And then after that, she gained a lot of weight. You know, she's on movies too. Can't think of her name.
Okay. Well, I'm thinking specifically of a commercial for Lay's potato chips that I saw one time. That the gist of it was you buy this great big bag of potato chips, like more than a pound, and you kept it to yourself. You know, don't share it. This is for you. No one needs a pound of potato chips. You know, so that was one thing, and all of the ads for soda pops. One of the functions of sugar in our diet is to tell our metabolic system that we have enough food. And one of the things that always bothered me about all of these foods that have no sugars in them, and especially diet sodas, is that the body's not getting a signal not to eat. Now, we've seen this with our kids. One of the reasons parents learn, if they're observing, when the kid comes home after school, not to give them a cookie is because they're not hungry. They don't want to eat dinner. Kids know when they don't need to eat because their stomach is not telling them, their body is telling them they have enough sugar. So then you eat sugar, but you don't eat nutritional food or any food, or you fight it. And I've watched this turn into battles between parents and kids, and we've tried to deal with one of our cousins who just did not want to hear this, that it's not appropriate to feed your kids a bunch of potato chips and popcorn and cookies as soon as they get home from school, and then get mad at them because they don't eat dinner at 5. She could not get this. She could not figure out why that was wrong, why that was a problem. She just thought they were being whatever about food. So we've had, so there's that part of it. The other is that since you drink these things to not have sugar, your body doesn't think it's had anything that it needs, and it actually is hungrier, and then you overeat. So you see people that drink a heck of a lot of diet soda and gain weight, and they wonder why. And it's because their bodies have learned that diet soda doesn't provide any value, and the body begins to crave food, and they lose the ability to recognize when they've had enough. That's been a major problem. And I've watched it in our family many, many times. One of the questions here is, can you think of some changes in your daily schedule that could increase your physical activity level? Now, having said that, it depends on what you do for a living. I don't know. What are you doing these days, Brandy? Right. So you're on your feet. You're on your feet a lot. And I know Layla works in a pharmacy. You don't sit down in a pharmacy. So you're on your feet. But on your feet and getting exercise is not the same thing. My goodness. What's going on over there, Layla? So, and I've thought about this, how can I get some more physical activity? And one of the things I thought was, well, I'm here, all afternoon, Monday and Wednesday. Why don't I just take a mid-afternoon walk? So today I had a meeting right after my morning class and a meeting just before this class and preparation time in between. Couldn't do it. Even though that was my intention. So the thing is, how can you arrange your life to do that? A lot of people will go out and walk the dog. The dog doesn't care how fast you go. The dog can outwalk you. So, if you are if you're out there just pumping right along, then the dog is fine. So it's a good way to do it if you have a dog. If you don't have a dog, walk your imaginary dog, right? So just think about that. What can you do? What can you do? And I don't really have an answer. Okay. So questions or comments?
Well, I do have to walk my client.
Yeah, and I don't know if your client is like my mother-in-law. Okay, so it seems like Brandy is also online. Brandy, you there? Can you speak?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, great. I'm glad you're on. So that's good. That gives me half the class. Okay. Okay. So let's see. Get out of that. So there's a lot so it's really interesting to see my generation. We're the baby boom generation. And the number of people that are in my generation that are significantly overweight. I mean, I'm overweight. I know that. I am nowhere near as overweight as many of my peers. And it amazes me how many people in my generation are looking at early demise because of their lifestyle. And a lot of it has to do with being obese, but also, other factors are there. But when I was younger, most of my peers were in, did not have a weight problem. We've always had some that did, but most of my peers didn't. And now many of them are quite large, and it's killing them young. My generation may actually live shorter lives than my parents' generation, simply because of the lifestyle that's been chosen, which is really kind of distressing. I'm the eldest of three. One of my younger sisters has already died, and my other one is, I'm barring accident or some strange disaster, I'm going to outlive her too. And that was a sobering revelation when I figured it out. And it really bothered me for a while. I've learned to live with it, but it really bothered me for a while. And it's all lifestyle. The older of my two sisters, her death was a lifestyle death. And my younger sister is going to go before me for the same reason, lifestyle. And it really is, it's kind of disturbing, but it does me no good to nag. Okay. Okay, I'm going to go find another PowerPoint. But let's, before I do that, let's talk about the rest of this week. Let's talk about the rest of this week. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so I think I'm sharing the shell. The rest of this week, we have the assignments. Assignments 1 and 2. Assignment 1 is to read the chapters and write a paper about them, same as last week. Assignment 2 concerns an investigation of some stuff from the Surgeon General and the Childhood Weight and Obesity Prevention Initiative. So let's have you make sure you work on that. I need to see it soon so I can start grading. So it's not a huge assignment, but it is something that is considered an important public health issue. Then let's go down here. So the other thing is, I want to remind people that Monday is Labor Day. There is no class. The school is closed. And so but the fact that the school is closed does not mean that we don't have work to do. And that includes me. So there will be some, let's see. There will be the usual, there's a discussion next week and an assignment, a couple of assignments. And then we'll have class on Wednesday of next week. But the chapters that you're reading next week are chapters 20 through 25 of your textbook. And that's what you'll be doing assignment 1 on. So what I want you to do is be working on those. And then if you have questions or issues, you can always email me, but we need to get those started. And there's also an assessment next week, so that's not an issue either. You're expecting that. But we have an assessment this week as well. So I need everyone working on that, holiday or no, working on those assignments. So any questions from anyone? Okay. In that case, what I would like to do is to take our first break a bit early for 15 minutes, and then come back and we'll talk about some other things. So let's take a short break. I'm going to stop recording, but I'll be back on in 15 minutes. Resume the recording. And we'll just make sure we're sharing this. Okay. All right, we're back on. Can someone tell me if you're seeing the PowerPoint for Chapter 17?
No.
No.
No, we're still on your
Okay.
week
And we'll
2
do
overview. Your week 2.
Okay. How about now? Chapter 17?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Good. So chapter 17 is about injuries. The statement here at the beginning, injuries are not accidents. There's good reason to argue with that statement. But very often injuries are the result of carelessness, inattentiveness, or impaired judgment, half a dozen other things. So the issue is that most injuries can be avoided. We're talking here, the slide puts us in 2 classes of categories of death from injury. One is unintentional and the other is intentional. Injuries are the 4th leading cause of death. The leading cause for death ages 1 to 44. Higher rates in groups with lower socioeconomic status, etc. Many injuries are not fatal. And I'm thinking about lots of things like slipping with a carving knife and cutting your hand. Most people won't report that. They don't even consider it an injury. But many of them are not fatal, but fatal injuries are the ones that we can really count on being reported because there's a death involved. Excuse me while I have some water. The costly injuries are those that leave people disabled, especially CNS, head and spinal cord injuries. They're costly to society on many, many, many levels. First off, the costs of maintaining medically are there, but the societal costs include the cost of time that is lost from family caregivers. People often will lose jobs because they're caring for an injured person. The injured person clearly often is incapable of working. So there's just lots of societal issues that come from disabling injuries. And these injuries occur from motorcycle accidents, from other kinds of injuries, work injuries, automobile accidents, and with higher rates of very serious injury resulting from people who don't wear protective equipment, head protection and other kinds of protection in motorcycle riders, and seat belts in automobiles. Seat belts were an interesting thing. Seat belts started being mandated in this country in the 1960s. And specifically, I think 1963 was when they started being really pushed. Because I remember the car we had at the time, this is back in the days when a family would have one car and that's it, instead of one for every driver. But the cars didn't have seat belts, so they had to be retrofitted. And one of the protests was, who's going to pay for it? If the government mandates it, shouldn't the government pay for it? And I can argue both ways on that. But the ultimate was, you pay for it. And all new cars had to have seat belts. So any new car you bought had a seat belt, and the rest of them did not. So we had no seat belts in our car. We had to put them on. And I remember that my father wasn't real happy about that, but he was a military man. When you were given orders, you followed them. So we got seat belts. Now seat belts are something that virtually everyone's used to. We still have a number of people in our society that won't wear them. We have a cousin who's our age that we have to tell her to put her seatbelt on when she gets in our car. We will not go without a seatbelt because we can be stopped. Now, it used to be the driver was ticketed for a passenger not having a seatbelt. Now, the passenger can be ticketed, which is where it belongs. But do you want to have a human being-sized missile flying around in your car if you have an accident? The answer is, of course not. That's a good way to have somebody, even with a seatbelt, get severely injured. So seatbelts were an issue. And we still have friends who refuse to wear them. My wife's a physical therapist. She has a very close friend who's a physical therapist who refuses to wear seatbelts. And her excuse is that if she has an accident, she'd just as soon be dead rather than paralyzed. That's baloney. Even without a seatbelt, her chances of surviving an accident are very high. Without a seatbelt, that survival probably involves severe injury, perhaps head or spinal cord trauma. You're still alive and you're dealing with it. So, it just really is crazy. What are the leading causes? Well, there's there's a whole laundry list here on this slide: poisoning, motor vehicle injuries, which includes motorcycles and automobiles. Firearm injuries. There are many accidents. You know, we talk about shootings and fatalities, but there are far more accidental um, deaths from firearms and injuries from firearms than from somebody going out and trying to kill people. Falls, suffocation comes from many things. This is mainly for children. Drowning can happen in an inch of water under the right circumstances. Fires, cuts, pierces, lots of different causes that we can have. Um, the what they call the injury pyramid, the ones that we know we have the best handle on of deaths. Hospital discharges are the second most reliable source of information. Emergency department visits the third, and then random reports of injuries are the least reliable of those things. So we have that kind of thing. Injuries are brought on by our behavior. We do things that are dangerous. People who do extreme sports, their injuries are because they're doing extreme sports. They're taking excessive risk. But there are other factors. And a lot of it has to do with safety, sheer safety. Many years ago, we were in China. This is before, this was just after China and the United States, quote, normalized relations in 1979. And we were at a wood processing plant, a tree processing plant. They were, you know, debarking and turning trees into construction lumber. And we were watching this process, and we were looking at a gigantic saw. The saw blade itself was about 6 feet in diameter. And the trees that they were debarking with this saw blade were probably 3 feet in diameter. So they were big. And the blade itself was gigantic. And what happened is they had these, they would put the log on a little set of rollers, and then workers would manually push the log down this spinning saw blade that was, as I said, at least 6 feet in diameter. And we were watching this. And I looked at our guide and I said, don't you guys wear safety equipment? And the expression he gave me told me what the answer was. I mean, he didn't even understand the question. And I said, well, they've got a saw blade running and they're not even wearing safety goggles. And he started laughing. He thought that was hilarious. Why? Didn't get a straight answer. My interpretation is, people are cheap, saws are expensive. And that's been a Chinese attitude. Nowadays, I suspect there's a little more, but in the United States, that would have been illegal. That would have gotten a major fine from OSHA for having someone that close and moving things manually through a high-speed saw blade. Good way to end up with arms cut off and everything else. So safety is a part of it. Most people who are really injured in not high-speed automobile accidents are not cognizant of safety. They're not wearing safety belts. Motorcyclists who cruise down the road without a helmet are playing Russian roulette. I've watched drivers nearly knock motorcyclists off the road, and I've wondered on occasion if it was deliberate. But if at high speed, and we're talking 60, 70 miles an hour, at that kind of a speed, a motorcycle that goes off the road, the driver's dead. Now, is he dead with or without the safety equipment? Probably. Does he have a better chance of survival with safety equipment? Better. But I see bicyclists the same way, cruising down the road on busy roads with no helmet, no knee pads, no protective equipment of any sort. Now, unless you're racing the Tour de France, you're going to have knee pads and other things. Knee pads just provide air resistance in a bicycle race, so they won't wear them. But most of them will wear a helmet. And they make good lightweight aerodynamic helmets now. But people that don't wear helmets are, again, playing Russian roulette. And it might not even be a car that takes care of you. You hit a patch of gravel. I've had bicycles go out from under me on a patch of gravel. So it's not healthy. Other things, most, as I said, many firearms, if not most firearms injuries in this country are, quote, accidental. They're not a deliberate event, and it's because someone is not cognizant of safety. Many of the deaths, especially when you hear about a child killing himself with his parents' gun, playing with it, that's because the parents are at fault for not observing the safety rules of owning a firearm around children. So the public health approach looks at what we call the chain of causation. Remember, with infectious disease, the chain runs from an infectious organism is in a reservoir. It leaves the reservoir via some sort of portal of exit. It is transmitted by some method to another portal of entry. In this case, we'll talk about human disease. So some way it gets into a human being, and then that human being is susceptible to the disease, gets sick, and either dies or recovers, but also then is now a reservoir for the disease and can pass it on. So theoretically, we can break the chain at any place. With firearms, one of the ways to break the chain of injury is through making certain that the gun is incapable of firing a bullet. You can do that. You can partially disassemble the firing mechanism of any gun, and it will not set off, it will not fire. Or the simpler expedient is to make sure that it's always unloaded, except when it's going to be used. An unloaded gun isn't going to kill somebody under almost any circumstance. There are some very rare circumstances. Used as a club, you could kill somebody with it. But, that's not what most people do, because then you have to get too close to your victim, and he might beat you. So you don't get into that. So we can change that. With infectious disease, theoretically, we can block any of those points on the chain. Some of them are much more difficult than others. With automobile injuries, we can take care of some of the injuries, automobile and motor vehicle injuries, by the simple use of safety equipment and building safer vehicles. Okay. So there are lots of looking at what happens. Training with automobiles. I don't know if any of you know about a driving school known as Master Drive. Master Drive is something that was started by I think he was a NASCAR racer, but he was a professional racer, automobile racer. His daughter was killed in an automobile accident, and he went to the site of the accident and realized that if she had had better driving skills, she would be alive. So he started Master Drive. And with Master Drive, they put you through not just academic training and basic driving training, but before you finish the class, they take you to a specially constructed course, and they put you through all sorts of emergencies. That includes skid pads. That includes driving along and having a light suddenly change. That includes driving along and have something bounce in front of your car. They don't let a person run in front of your car. But when I was learning to drive, we were taught that a bouncing ball is always followed by a child. So if you see a ball bouncing across the road, hit the brakes. This is basic safety. And this is how you prevent most accidents. Automobile accidents, I read a statistic, 35% of all automobile accidents, there is no sign that either any of the parties involved in the accident took any evasive action. No skid marks, no car that was half off the road trying to get out of the way. Basically, and we saw this happen just a few weeks ago with a car that was coming up behind my son-in-law on Taft Hill Road. And it was going north. There was a lot, it was rush hour, so there was a lot of southbound traffic on Taft Hill Road. And he looked up and there was a guy who was just barreling down the road behind him. And then he pulled over into the other lane. Now remember, Taft Hill Road is a 2-lane road between Loveland and Fort Collins. Pulled over into the lane and there's a bunch of oncoming traffic. So Daniel, who films racing cars, knows a lot about driving, is the best driver in our entire family, slows down and lets the guy, get in. Fortunately, nobody else was doing anything. All the cars oncoming were going at full speed. He was going at full speed. So one of the other people in the car said, well, that proves that statistic. Only one of the 3 cars that would have been involved in the accident did anything. So prevented it because observation and safety. Okay. So there's there's lots of ways of looking at them, at how to prevent injuries, and look at injuries. You want to know what was going on before. Today we were told by Joel, our campus director, he was showing a video. A guy was talking about a young man, 14 years old, who found a rattlesnake in his garage. So he knew how to pick up snakes. The way you pick up a snake is you grasp it by the neck. The neck is right behind the head on a snake, even though the whole thing looks like neck. But you pick it up behind the head, snakes can't bite you. So he picked it up and he was running around, being a 14-year-old idiot, running around and pointing it at his playmates and pretending. And finally, somebody comes up to him and starts talking to him. And he stopped concentrating on holding the snake. If you're going to pick up a rattlesnake, you hold on to it. You're stuck, really literally, until you can find a way to get rid of it. Okay? And there's lots of ways to do that. But he accidentally dropped it, and the snake bit him right on the hand because he was being stupid. So you want to be careful and remember that injuries are a result of not paying attention more than anything else. So what happens? Automobiles needed safety belts, seat belts. So we got seat belts. So that was an engineering solution to a problem, which was severe injuries occurring from people who bounce up against the steering wheel. Years ago, I was rear-ended by a woman in a snowstorm in Denver who wasn't wearing a seatbelt, and she was pregnant. She was about 9 months pregnant. And when she hit me from behind, she, of course, went into her steering wheel. Well, the cop that came to investigate panicked and got her to the hospital, which was good, but she wasn't wearing any protection, no way to stop. Education is important, and then you have to establish some regulations. We enforced the engineering solution on a car. Back in the 60s, we had a car which was a Chevrolet Corvair, the Chevrolet Corvair. tended to have a problem in an accident, and it would tend to, the gas tank would rupture and the car would catch on fire, because it was a car where the engine was not up front, but it was in the center of the car. So there were lots of fatalities. GM fought doing anything about it, refused to admit any responsibility until they were targeted by a man by the name of Ralph Nader, a name you may be familiar with, who was a lawyer and who wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed about the Corvair. And that prompted a backlash against GM, and they pulled the car off the market, and they never marketed another mid-engine car. Same thing happened to Ford with the Pinto, with exploding gas tanks. So there are many, and unfortunately, somebody had to be hurt. And in each case, a number of people had to be killed before anything was done. But looking at how this worked, education, some sort of law, and an engineering solution worked, and has been successfully applied to that. Children in automobiles now have to be in car seats. That's an engineering solution. And it's working pretty well. A lot of children's lives. Poisonings. And they talk here about controlled substances, which is a major source of poisoning and death. But there are other things. Very potent drugs like digoxin used to be major causes of problems in kids, because they would get into their parents' or grandparents' medicine chest and take the pill bottle out, and they would think that they were candy, and they'd eat them. And fortunately, there weren't a whole lot of deaths. Fortunately, you can rescue these kids, but it led to the prescription drug packaging laws. And so now the child-resistant packaging that we have on all of our medications is as a result of exactly that. So, but we do have now the rise now in poisonings by controlled substances are causing some major issues. And one thing that we did is the one thing that we did was to actually move Vicodin into a more into a higher schedule, up to Schedule 2, which cut down on its ability. Even though that was done 2 years ago, drug overdoses on opiates, excuse me, are still rising. In fact, there were 7,000 more of them last year in 2017 than in 2016. So we still haven't dealt with that particular form of poisoning. And here's a slide about the automobiles that I mentioned. There are lots of issues. Experience is another factor in motor vehicle injuries that I didn't mention. When we lived in North Carolina, school bus drivers school buses could be driven by 16-year-olds. Now, 16-year-olds, this is somebody who's just gotten his driver's license, and he's driving a bus with 40 or 50 kids in it. We had a few accidents. And in North Carolina, it occasionally snows, and people in North Carolina are clueless when it comes to driving in snow. At least in the eastern part of the state where we lived. So they, after a couple of accidents and some fatalities, they stopped that and they raised it to 18. Well, 18 is slightly better, but not much. But we have, that was a case of inexperience. And the other thing is we've been really cracking down on cell phone use in cars. That has played a contributing factor in many crashes. So in fact, it was a contributing factor, I'm convinced, in the accident that totaled my wife's car and ended her career as a home health PT. Guy ran a red light well after the light was red, and the witnesses said he was looking down as he ran it. He ran it at 45 miles an hour, driving a Chevy Tahoe. So a big, heavy vehicle. It totaled my wife's minivan. And, as I said, it ended her career. She was injured, not severely, but it was enough to end her career as a home health PT. So it was, he was, by all accounts, he was looking at his cell phone when he ran a light. And it had been red for a while, but it's one of the factors that drives me crazy, watching people use cell phones. When I'm driving, if my cell phone rings, I don't answer it. If I'm with someone else, I hand them my phone. That's it. Pedestrians and bicyclists, there are a number of deaths, and we have to, helmets are, again, this is all the difference in our federal versus our states' rights argument. Helmet laws are state by state. So not even half the states require motorcyclists to wear helmets. And just over half the states require helmets for what they call younger drivers. And I don't know what that is. So firearms we've talked about. Occupational injuries, there are quite a few. Used to be a lot more. OSHA and the regulatory agency, and then the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, which is a research group, have helped really cut occupational injuries by just requiring certain kinds of safety equipment, steel-toed shoes, helmets, protection, even stronger protection when working in dangerous environments like welding and that sort of thing. So those injuries are cut. Many of them are using motor vehicles, and apparently logging and fishing are the most dangerous. Well, I don't know about fishing so much. I'm not sure why fishing unless boats turn over, but I know that logging trucks are top heavy, so they would be much more have a tendency to actually turn over. Domestic violence is epidemic in this country, and a lot of it has to do with other stresses in life, rather than intentional. Oh, I think I'll beat up my significant other today, kind of things. And children, a lot of it has to do with anger management as well. A lot of children are injured, many die. And we're talking about sexual abuse as well as physical abuse. It's really quite rampant. The amount of violence that we have. Traumatic brain injury, known as TBI. Over 2 million Americans are treated every year for some form of what we call non-fatal traumatic brain injury. A fatal traumatic brain injury, of course, is simply treated as an accidental death. A mild TBI is known as a concussion. A severe TBI can result in loss of function. The most famous currently of the TBI is what we call cerebral traumatic encephalopathy, or chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is experienced, which was made aware in the book Concussion, and then a movie, Concussion, about a physician who discovered that there were really severe changes, morphological changes in the brains of football players who were having trouble, had a long career and then had severe problems, now we've become much more associated. TBIs are treated a lot of ways. A lot of it is counseling. A lot of it is other forms of physical therapy to try and recover what physical therapy, what physical function has been lost. Drugs don't help. An injured brain we used to think that an injured brain could not recover. That's not 100% true. Brains are remarkably plastic and can recover from a lot of things. Again, any injury is treatment is much more successful if it's quick. Sometimes that's not necessarily easy to do, but the quality of care, there are now plenty of places that specialize in trauma, and so these trauma centers, we're finding more and more that the more specialized a facility and a doctor is, the better the quality of care for the patients. My favorite example is a hospital in, I think, Toronto, Canada. The only thing they do is knee surgery. The only thing. They don't do anything else. If you have a shoulder problem, you don't go there. If it's a hip problem, you don't go there. If you have a knee problem, it's one of the best in the world. Why? Because they have the knowledge. They have seen everything that can go wrong. And they have experience. And they have a whole team of people. They have some of the best results in the world. And we're finding that places that really do, I mentioned Monday, Northern Colorado Rehab Hospital, they don't do surgery or any of that. It's just rehabilitation. They have a tremendous physical and occupational therapy department. And they have really good therapists. And they have a huge staff. Because really, that's key, is having a big, experienced staff. And that's all they do, is rehab. And it's actually, physical medicine is now a specialty.
My grandma has been there like 5 times already.
Oh.
But my cousin, she's trying to get her job back there. She moved to UC Health, but she likes that better than UC Health.
Yeah. Well, I hope she can. I was impressed. So anyway, here we have some questions. I'm not going to go through a lot of them here. We don't have enough classmates to do a survey. So we're going to actually leave it off here for tonight. I'm going to go to a new share again. And no, I don't want that. I want that. Yeah, I do want that. All right. So reminder, no class on Monday. What we're going to do, Randy, we're going to stay here, but I'm going to end the lecture part of the class and let you work on some of your assignments for this week. Layla, you're the only one left on. Brandy had to leave. This is going to be the end. You don't have to send me any sort of code word or anything.
Okay.
But I will say that for those who are not online, the code word for this one is going to be a strange word for many people, or a strange spelling, and it is candy, and it's spelled K-A-N-D-Y. So that's the code word for listening to this lecture. Now, again, a reminder, the various assignments for next week still need to be done. I will get the discussion, I'll get my first post on the discussion as quickly as possible and open it. I think I have the assignments. No. Okay, we'll open up the assignments as of tomorrow morning. And so people have a chance to get started early. I know it's a holiday weekend, but good luck on the holiday. Have fun with it. Let's get this one as well. Let's see if we've got that. Okay. We'll have this assignment as well available first thing in the morning. And the assessment. Okay. Okay. Okay, so everything except the discussion for next week is now open. So I'm going to end the class here. Have a good weekend, and I'll see you next Wednesday, or perhaps not see you, Layla, next Wednesday, but you'll be online.
Yep.
Yeah, you'll be online, so I won't worry about that. So anyway, I will hope, as I say, hope everyone has a good weekend, and so I'm going to end the class now.
Have a good night, Mike.
Thanks. You too, Layla.